Hello, and welcome to Doctor Who 50 Years Ago, the show that looks back to the episode that aired in 1967 and looks at the differences between then and now. This week, episode 3 of the Faceless Ones, insert contextual airline news here. I am Ben.
I'm Luke.
And I'm Nick.
Before we get dragged off kicking and screaming, here we go into the news from 1967. On Monday, the 17th of April, the US launched the server-free lunar probe in the third American attempt to make a soft landing on the moon. And on Wednesday, the 19th of April, it landed and analysed the chemical composition of the lunar surface, sending data back to Earth. It's quite literally small steps for the Americans in the space race.
It's important to remember that it seems very hard if you were 50 years ago in 1967, the Soviet Union was definitely winning the space race. They'd done all the big firsts up to this point. So, yeah, and the fact that it took the Americans 3 tries to get a soft landing on the moon is a bit embarrassing, really.
I mean, they've just char-grilled their first astronauts.
It's kind of hard to remember that back then America would have been viewed as the underdog in the space race.
Absolutely, yeah. On Friday, the 21st of April, Greece was taken over by a military dictatorship, led by Colonel George Papadopoulos, probably, with no opposition from the king or the prime minister. The plotters had followed a set of instructions created by NATO for response to the threat of a communist takeover of the royal government. This dictatorship lasts for 7 years. So the Cold War can institute military takeovers in the West. Yeah, it's like Central Latin America and Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
Only this is a little bit closer to home and somewhere underneath the Iron Curtain.
The Americans would much rather have a military dictatorship in a country that is right-wing than have even allow to have a left-wing socialist government. Doesn't even have to be fully communist, a la Chile in a few years' time. Greece borders Bulgaria, which literally that border was part of the Iron Curtain. Yeah, Albania and Bulgaria border Greece, and they were both kind of like pro-Soviet / China communist countries.
Yeah, capitalist communist staring intensifies. It's the Cold War in a nutshell.
Yeah.
And finally, on Saturday the 22nd of April, American inspectors inspected Israel's nuclear research centre and concluded it was not developing atomic weapons, but, quote, was aiming to reach a point where it could have a nuclear option at hand. The country assembled 2 nuclear bombs 7 weeks later, which, as a precursor to the Six-Day War coming this summer, see it in movie theatres, is...
Is that confirmed? Seeing as I know Israel, there's always been a bit of a cloud of secrecy over it, and Israel's always...
I think it's in the permanent state of not confirmed. I think the point here is that we are now moving on from the sort of big nations, the ones in World War II that led to the development of the nuclear research program, and now we're on the third wave of nuclear-armed states.
Although it's a sign of how successful proliferation was at this time, that only a handful of states, other than the 5 permanent United Nations Security Council members, beyond them, only a handful of countries developed nuclear weapons. So it was quite successful in stopping the spread of weapons.
There you are. We end the news on nuclear proliferation. Don't have nightmares. That was the news. And now we shall get into the Faceless Ones episode 3, which is guilty of changing its tone entirely. Luke.
This starts to go into this crime drama Avengers territory, where the Faceless Ones start to become like gangsters, and the Doctor is this rogue cop, and it's all lorded over by the policeman. We've completely changed tone now that we're in contemporary Earth to the predominant genre in contemporary Earth at that time. That's very interesting. For a filler episode, this is probably the best way you could have done it for 1967, if you wanted to keep your viewers around.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. It's it gives the character and plot development that the story requires in episode 3, as well as shifting that tone in order to keep the audience occupied for another 22 minutes.
It's stretching it.
This is episode 3, so we're sort of reaching that period where it just sort of needs to pause for a while, let the audience kind of catch their breath, and sort of, just get into a rhythm. We can't really build... We're not to the point where we have the climax yet, so...
No, but we are leading towards the end of Act 2 cliffhanger that episode 4 has, like the episode 4 of Power of the Daleks and other episode 4s in other 6-part serials.
I would say this episode is slowly builds up the stakes as well. The stakes have increased a little bit from each episode increases the stakes. I would say each cliffhanger is getting more and more interesting.
The Doctor foils the plan to kill him with the pen he stole from the previous episode, freezing Spencer and escaping the gas trap. Inspector Crossland has learnt from Jamie that his colleague was murdered, and the Doctor joins them outside the Chameleon Tours kiosk. The pilots start devising a new method to kill the Doctor. With the Inspector's help, the Doctor can pressure the Commandant, whilst Jamie and Samantha decide to look around the Chameleon Tours hangar, the latter forcing the former to do so, through her feminine wiles. Here's character and plot development in the first 5 minutes. Hooray!
Bit which intrigued me about the cliffhanger resolution is when he puts his coat over the camera. It strikes me that today, the Doctor's coat is no longer just a coat as it was back here. It's now got all those transcendental pockets, and if he loses his coat, it's a massive deal. And it says something about how back here, the Doctor was a lot more rugged and low-tech.
It's the development of how much you can fully explore a character. For example, you didn't need to know the hat size of the police force in Z-Cars, for example.
Very happy with the cliffhanger and the resolution. It's not overdone. The music's still very subtle. The Doctor isn't being overly shouty. Like, Troughton's not hamming it up or anything. No one's hamming it up. No one's overdoing it. It just has this kind of air of creepiness and dread to it, which I feel like the very kind of subtle musical cues help to kind of imbue it with.
The very few turn to camera and we're going to deal with him, insert musical sting, bits don't actually detract.
Yeah.
Whereas in other episodes with music, it could be construed as over the top.
What's a pivotal point of this episode is when Captain Blade threatens Spencer, and he says, "You will atone for your incompetence when you kill the Doctor." And you can almost imagine them with Italian accents and Spencer on his knees begging the Godfather. There's this mafia mentality that it becomes gangsters versus cops, which for 1967 would do just nicely.
It's the perfect tonal shift, which I'm very certain is quickly dropped in episode 4.
If we look at the tonal shift in the 10th Planet,
Yes.
that had a very desperate air to it when it became a war historical in part 3. Whereas here, it blends a lot better with last week. It doesn't feel as rushed, and since it's the 60s anyway, it blends in a lot better.
In air traffic control, the Commandant listens to the Doctor's findings, and he also finds the alien meadows. That matches the comatose meadows in the Chameleon Tours hangar. He also demonstrates the freezing pen and deduces from all this evidence, including Gascoigne's murder, that the Tours are kidnapping the young'uns. Convincing the authorities is difficult, especially as the Doctor thinks Chameleon Tours are aliens. The pen's effect scares Meadows off, giving the Doctor some leverage over the suited and tied authority figures that are the Commandant and the Inspector. And there is the relationship that Luke's talking about of the Doctor being the rogue cop who doesn't go by the rules and has all the wacky and clever ideas that are actually what are happening, versus the authority figures, as I say, suited and booted, who are like, "Oh, most unorthodox!"
You can't be serious, Doctor. I don't like your methods.
They have some sort of footage that they presumably filmed whilst they were on location at Gatwick. Not overdone. Just some more establishing shots reminding you that you're in Gatwick Airport.
the sound design adds to that, because always in the background there's this radio chatter when they're in the control office. And the fact that they spend so much of the story here means that you soak up that air.
Bringing that tonal shift of a mundane setting and something alien and unsettling happening in it. There you are. It's good writing from Malcolm Hulke.
The pen uses ice, as did the gun things at the beginning, which throws the Doctor. And what's good about this is that we have themed aliens, and those were quite big in strange sci-fi, where tremble under the ice weapons of the Faceless Ones.
Yes, that's true. Contextually speaking, it's basically taking to an extreme the fetishizing the white heat of technological revolution that the 60s is best known for.
And so it's interesting to see a society go off in a different split from that.
Jamie and Samantha discover more postcards that determine the young people were kidnapped and go to the Commandant's office to add to the evidence to investigate Chameleon Tours further. Reluctantly, the Commandant allows him 12 hours to investigate further with Crossland, him being the Doctor. And again, to add to the crime drama section, we now have a time limit, a race against time to actually find the culprits.
You got 12 hours, so-called Doctor. You gotta get something in my desk then, or your history. Your methods don't seem that good to me, but by God, you got some results so far.
Yes, and then the airport will blow sky high, which will literally make it an airport.
While this is going for that crime drama aspect, it is interesting to see Jamie and Samantha run in and have to really force that crime drama aspect. They're so panicky because they don't think that they're allowed to do it. And it's good to see the characters sort of fight their way into the genre.
They're emotionally charged, as seen with the scene before they rush off. Samantha actually having emotions over her brother.
It's good to have that distance between her and the Doctor, who's much more calm and knows what he's doing, rather than in the modern day, where someone like Clara is generally always perky, always at ease, and always has an answer to everything. Whereas here, Jamie and Samantha are panicky and a little bit out of their depth against these authority figures, which is nice to see.
It's something the audience can get identify with. Spencer and Meadows' plan to remove the Doctor so their plans can progress is with a mechanism which will kill him. The Doctor and crew investigate a Chameleon Tours plane arriving at Gatwick Airport, whilst Meadows plots the device on the Doctor's back so it can go off. Nobody notices it for the last 10 minutes of the episode. Crossland meets Spencer and he arranges to take the Inspector to inspect the plane so he can deal with him, whilst Jamie and the Doctor inspect the Chameleon Tours hangar.
The Doctor says, "Jamie, have you ever known me to be mistaken?" And then Jamie replies tersely with, "I." And it's great to see that Jamie is being shown as being this kind of feisty companion who's willing to sort of tell the Doctor you're wrong at various points, and he doesn't just obey everything he says. He's shown to have his independent streak.
Expanding on the humour point, the humour, when it is in the episode, serves the story well. It actually injects something into this hyper-realised crime drama that we are now watching and analysing.
Yeah.
The Doctor takes apart the entire premise of the story, doppelgangers, when he bumps into Meadows. You must have a double. It's an underplayed joke that goes down really well.
Yeah, and it adds moments of levity to something that would otherwise be kind of unrelentingly bleak.
What I like about that "you must have a double" line is that it very much strikes me as what the Seventh Doctor would end up doing really well, which is when he would slip in a comment that he knew would end up revealing something by your facial expression.
For one, it's great characterisation for a character that needed to be evolved at this crucial period in Doctor Who's history. In the plane, the Inspector questions Captain Blade about the suspicious troubles, and is promptly locked and tied up in the cockpit, which has futuristic controls, which answers all his questions somewhat. They're going on a journey. The Doctor and Jamie find the control room and areas where chameleons are stored, as well as where they end up, the first aid post. And that's where they're going to go. But Spencer activates the device and the Doctor collapses. Blade's plane takes off, and in a boast, I can't even say it, fit to peak, he shows the kidnapped Inspector Crossland that he can make all the young passengers seemingly disappear. 2 cliffhangers for the price of 1, as I said.
Although we've been saying throughout this serial that everyone hasn't been acting very hammily, maybe it's just because I like to latch on to hammy aspects, but Captain Blade's last line to the Inspector cracked me up. It's the way he says it.
Yeah, it's the arched eyebrow as well.
I have some arrangements to make. And then he walks off, and then he has the ray gun. And I loved that. And he says, we're going on a little journey.
The story knows where it can risk things, and it doesn't necessarily detract. Yeah.
There's a bit in Frontier in Space where the Master is chasing the Doctor on a spaceship. And the Master says, no other ship would be on a course for Earth at a time like this. And the Ogon next to him says, we are on a course for Earth. And the Master says, well, naturally, because we're chasing them. And I always crack up at that bit. And here the comedy is the Doctor has thrown out all of the tins across the floor, and it's the last tin on the top shelf that is the one that he needs. And for some reason I really laughed at that. And there's a bit later where James says, should we clear up the mess? And the Doctor just says, no. And I think it says something about that messy room style of anarchism that I think would quite appeal to kids. Sort of, I'm not tidying my room. Take that, Mum.
Yeah, it almost shows, again, a rebellious streak. Another aspect of Hulkian humour, if we're going to coin that phrase, that I can think of is in the Silurians, where the Doctor is jabbed with the injection to combat the Silurian virus, and Liz does it, and the Doctor says, well, Liz says, how was it? And the Doctor replies, oh, agony. It's that sort of snarky, injectious humour that you can fight against the response you expect to happen. Good old Hulk.
Well, humour in New Who tends to detract from a scene rather than add to it, because it would be thrown in the middle of a dramatic moment for no particular reason, or it would be really out of place humour to appeal to someone in 21st century Earth, like a pop culture reference.
Yes, and anything that will eventually become a GIF on the Doctor Who Twitter page.
Humour in this story, it works to balance out the bleakness rather than actively detract from it. I've always said there should be an airlock period where you can have a comedic scene and a horror scene in the same episode or film, but they need to have that blending space between them where you gradually go into it. And this story so far has been keeping the two bits very separate.
As we've seen in this episode of the Faceless Ones, the humour needn't detract from the story in general, which is something that New Who writers often fall into the trap of, and we classic Who fans mock it relentlessly for. Because there is a case of you can have humour to inject a bit of reality and light relief in something as terrible, as tense, and as dramatic as the Faceless Ones. Unless you're the Massacre, in which case, God help you.
A good comparison to another prolific writer for classic who would also write stories that were quite adult would be Terry Nation. His scripts generally didn't have jokes in. They're usually quite bleak. Let's say Genesis of the Daleks in particular, that one is completely humorless. There are no jokes in that. There aren't any in the Daleks either, really. They do end up being quite bleak and dour, and they are, I would say, harder to watch. They're still really good, but I do feel like it's good to have those moments of humour and levity just to sort of stop it from being too bleak. Another writer to compare this to would be Robert Holmes, who he also would tackle some dark issues sometimes, but I would say he much like this script, would tend to usually put some humor in to kind of give it at least perk it up a little bit, or often you'd have double acts which kind of would play off each other quite comedically. So yeah, Jago and Lightfoot, for instance, in what would otherwise be quite a kind of bleak story in Talons of Wang Chiang, when they come together, they actually add quite a lot of humour to it. And even when they're not interacting with each other in, let's say, the first 4 parts, when they're just talking to the Doctor in separate scenes, they still add a bit of lightness to it, because it is quite a dark story. You need those moments of humour to make it more child-friendly, I think.
And it's interesting that by the time of the Caves of Androzani, you have a similar plot of this weird disfigured man kidnapping young women, but the double act in that one of Stotts and Croper, that's a very dark one without any humour. And as a result, that serial is a lot more grim and sort of out of place.
I think that's probably to do with, by the 80s, they were definitely, especially under
Eric Saywood,
yeah, they were aiming for a much darker tone. Yeah, I think Daleks and comedy just don't go together, because they're meant to be, they're space Nazis pretty much. So
The Chase.
That doesn't work.
Brotherhood of the Daleks.
Oh.
Yeah, The Chase isn't a very good story though, and it doesn't depict the Daleks at all very well.
The point we're trying to get to, and the point that I shall conclude is that comedy needn't commit a crime against an episode of Doctor Who, be it classic or modern, by tearing the story apart with terrible jokes. On the contrary, with things like we've seen with Hulk, and moving on to Holmes, and under Terence Dicks and Hinchcliffe, comedy can inject a nice bit of light relief into these tense, dramatic storylines that can make you think, even if they are in the 3rd episode of 6 and they have suddenly dramatically shifted in tone to being a crime drama. So this is the point we're trying to get to, you New Who. You can probably write comedy better. And the only reason we can tell you that is because we're Doctor Who fans who are comparing episodes from 50 years ago and now. Thank you very much for watching. You can find us on Blogspot, which redirects to iTunes. Leave positive comments there, it helps. You can also find us on Facebook and YouTube, where you can like, comment and subscribe, and Google Plus, if you dare. We shall be back next week to fly into the 4th episode of The Faceless Ones. Until then, I have been Ben.
I have been Luke.
I have been Nick.
Thank you, and goodbye.